So in chapter 12, we learned that immediately following the election of Abraham Lincoln, that South Carolina immediately secedes from the Union. They say we're done and are leaving the Union, so they immediately secede. By February of 1861, so just within a matter of a few short weeks, 7 total states secede from the Union and form what is known as the Confederate States of America. They have elected Jefferson Davis to be their president, and they believe that they are fighting against the Union, against Abraham Lincoln, and against those who seek to threaten their way of life and to disrupt their economy. Now, we're going to move into chapter 13, which will cover the Civil War today. But what we want to keep in mind is a couple of specific things that we've been talking about over the course of the past couple of videos. And so one of those things is that Dred Scott decision really infuriated the Southerners. Infuriated Lincoln and Northerners because it ruled that that a black man, whether free or enslaved, had no rights that a white person needed to respect. So they felt that they were being protected by the Supreme Court, even though Northern politicians, abolitionists, were trying to circumvent their freedom to own slaves. So these Confederate leaders really justified secession totally around the issue of slavery. They went further and argued that the North had not fully upheld the Fugitive Slave Act or the Dred Scott decision. And that much was true in that Northern abolitionists in particular did not uphold the Fugitive Slave Act and in fact worked to undermine the Fugitive Slave Act. So Southerners sort of felt that they were justified in leaving the Union, which they argued was not upholding the laws of the Union. They also believed that Republicans in power, particularly Lincoln, would not safeguard or protect the Southern interests. They also felt that the abolitionists, Republicans, would encourage and inspire more slave uprisings like that of Nat Turner. And of course, this was a fear of white slaveholders that there would be these uprisings. After his inauguration, Lincoln really did attempt to find a way to restore the Union. Lincoln, by all accounts, really did attempt to bring the Union together as much as he could. Recall that when Lincoln was immediately elected, President Buchanan does nothing to stop the South from leaving the Union. So as soon as Lincoln, is sworn in, he immediately tries to reconcile. But he doesn't want to reconcile in a way that shows himself or the Union to be weak in comparison to the Confederacy. So he decides to kind of demonstrate the strength of the Union by resupplying Fort Sumter, which is a northern fort, a Union fort, in South Carolina. So in response to this mission, which was planned, it was a resupply mission. It wasn't necessarily anything where the Union was trying to sort of sneak in and arm Union soldiers. This was a planned resupply mission. The Confederates immediately launch an attack on Fort Sumter. And when they do this, of course, it's unexpected from those at Fort Sumter. And so they surrender because they have no way really to defend themselves. They haven't been resupplied yet. So Lincoln immediately calls for 75,000 volunteers. This is not the regular American military at this time. It is just volunteers that he's calling for. And he calls for them to come together and work to defeat what he calls an insurrection. So he's not even recognizing the Confederate States as a separate entity. He recognizes them and calls them, rebels and those who are rising up against the government. Some of the small farmers and the landless whites in the upper South, so this is like North Carolina, parts of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. Remember, the upper part of the South was very close to some of those northern areas, some of those border states. And so some of the small farmers, the landless whites, the laborers in the upper South were very suspicious of the motives of these secessionist planters because they did not feel that the wealthy represented the interests, values, and needs of the small farmer, of the working man, or even of the immigrant group. Most Southerners supported secession, though, as a way to maintain white supremacy and power. So while they were suspicious of their wealthy neighbors, they also recognized that in order to maintain their position, their social position in society, that slavery needed to remain in place. Lincoln took some very specific steps to keep the border states um, from leaving the Union. And these border states like Kentucky, um, Delaware, Missouri, these states already had slavery and had long had slavery. Remember, the Missouri Compromise Agreement was that slavery would be allowed in Missouri. So Lincoln takes steps to keep the border states as part of the Union, and he is willing to overlook, right, slavery in those border states. Because he doesn't want them to secede. He doesn't want to lose the forts, the manpower, and the states in his union. This is also going to include Virginia. Now, the Confederates moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia, because this state was very, very important to the Southern economy, particularly because it was the largest manufacturer of iron, and it was semi-close to the U.S. Capitol as well. So this is, Richmond is an industrial area. And so the Southerners immediately decide to call this area their state capital, or the capital of the Confederacy. The the first secessions really increased the anxiety and the fear in the North over a lot of economic issues. Because remember, and we've talked about this several times, I always want to remind you that the North and the West, even though we don't see the same numbers of slaves, and some of these states have excluded slavery, are benefiting economically from the institution of slavery, what we call that peculiar institution. And so immediately when the South says, well, we're seceding, this triggers things in the North in which these mill owners, these factory owners recognize that now they're going to have to pay a lot more for cotton and supplies and things like that. So this impacts the northern economy. The attack on Fort Sumter, though, really kind of rallies the Northerners together, and they say, okay, we just need to kind of quash this little uprising in South Carolina, reunite the Union, and everything will be fine. Most people in February and March of 1861 sincerely believe that the Civil War will be, or this, not even a war yet, this little skirmish will be over within just a few months, if that long. What they believe is that pressure on Southern economy, lack of finished products and things like that, will really force the Confederate States to sort of, if you will, come crawling back to the North. We know that that's not the case, but keep in mind in 1861, as this war is beginning, most people in the North and the South really believe that, this will be over pretty quickly. So it's always important to look at the advantages that different sides have in the in the war. And some of those advantages, one is always the perceived advantage that you are right. So we know and we agree that slavery is immoral and that slavery is wrong, and there's no justification ever for slavery. However, we have to also understand that many people in the South and in the North believe that slavery is a natural part of life, and it's always been a part of society, and it will continue to be a part of society, and that it should be not necessarily viewed as immoral, but an unfortunate consequence. Now, some in the North, particularly Northern abolitionists, free blacks, have very distinct feelings and convictions about the immorality of slavery. But there are those in the South who have very strong convictions that slavery should be protected. And so one's personal belief in their rightness in a situation is an important advantage for them, at least in their mind. The Union does have some very specific and significant advantages over the Confederacy at the beginning of the war. The first one is that they have a significantly larger population. The next one is that they have higher levels of manufacturing and agricultural production. They also have more miles of railroad track, so that makes it easier to move troops and supplies across the Union. So to give you those again, the first one is that they have a significantly larger population. The second one is that they have higher levels of manufacturing and agricultural production. So they're not necessarily growing the product, but they're able to produce things with it. They're able to turn out new goods that can then be sold for a profit, for a dollar, for gold. And then the third one is that they have much more tracks of rail that has been laid. So that makes it much easier to move troops, to move supplies, to move food, cannons, weapons, those kinds of things across various parts of the North. So that speeds up their ability to transport. All right, the northern building up the Northern troops, I should say, really proves to be a challenge in terms of the numbers and the preparedness of volunteers. Remember, this is 1861. We've had some conflicts since the revolution, but not any conflicts that really required, total participation from fighting age men. And so primarily the people who fought in wars like the War of 1812, the Battle of the Alamo, those sorts of things, has really been people who either joined the military because that's what they wanted to do, or people who were sort of explorers and kind of rougher men who wanted to sort of live a different type of lifestyle. But the majority of people in the North and the South were not necessarily fighting ready and weren't necessarily accustomed to being engaged in battle. So there's some issues of, one, just having people to volunteer. And then of those who are already in the military, there's a lack of preparedness as a whole. Now, Lincoln is really going to have to rely on state militias as opposed to having a strong federal army, because the stronger federal army is very disorganized. They don't communicate well with one another. They don't tend to take orders from generals from other states, much like the conversations that we had during the Revolution. And so, the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of Massachusetts will fight and engage against kind of the Confederate military, so to speak, but there's some division. There's still this strong state identity even in the northern areas. Now, the Confederate troops also had disadvantages, and this is important to understand. Both sides have advantages. They're very different and distinct advantages, but they are advantages nonetheless. So the first one is that they have a lot more volunteers, and they also have longer enlistments. They also have the use of slave labor, which frees up a lot of the working men, the white men, to volunteer for the military. And they also had experienced military leadership, particularly men who had went to West Point and been trained in battle, had been trained in fighting and tactical advantages. The Confederacy actually had almost 300 West Point graduates in the Confederate Army. So I'm going to give you those again. The first one, and so they have more volunteers in the South, and they volunteer for longer enlistments. So again, people sign up very quickly in the South to defend the Confederacy and this cause, much more quickly than those do in the North, because again, not everyone in the North is an abolitionist. The second advantage of the South is that because they have slaves, they can sort of redelegate slaves to new positions, new labor, including cooking and tending wounds and taking care of livestock for the Confederate Army. But this means that with this sort of reallocation of slave labor, that there are more men who are able to now fight and enlist in the Union Army. For a lot of these working men, these landless laborers, this is the first time in their lives when they've actually earned what they consider to be a living wage. And then the third one, which I accidentally skipped the first time. The third one is that most of these early battles will be fought in the South. And so the Southerners have a tactical advantage in being very familiar with the land, knowing the terrain, and additionally being more adjusted to the climate in the South. And then the fourth one, the fourth advantage for the South, for the Confederacy, was that they have almost 300 West Point graduates who are officers and leaders in the Confederate military. Now, the first major battle in the South is fought in July in 1861. So again, this is just within a few months of the Confederate States being formed. It is a Confederate victory, and it really demonstrates the advantages of the South, and it is fought at a place called Bull Run. Now, the South didn't really follow up. So it had this huge victory, the first major battle, it's a Southern victory, but they don't really follow up with those victories, in part because both sides really think, okay, we've had this big battle, things will sort of calm down. Um, and so the Southerners don't really continue to attack aggressively to the north. At the same time, there is a Union blockade of all of the southern ports that begins. And when the Union blockades these southern ports, it becomes very evident that Southerners will need to be able to get any kind of supplies pretty much from, within their own country, that they will not be able to import supplies in terms of food, clothing, bandages, weapons, guns, munitions, all of those things. They won't be able to import those things from the rest of the world, so from Europe, Great Britain, places like that. Both sides pretty quickly in the summertime realized that this war is going to be a lot longer than anyone anticipated in February. So the belief that this will be over in a few months is quickly quelled. Here, this chart shows you different kind of advantages, so to speak, in terms of the economies. And we've talked about the entire country depends on slave labor pretty consistently through the previous chapters. But here in terms of population, about 61% of the population is in the north. About 66% of the railroad that has been laid up to 1861 is in the north. The majority of farms is actually in the north. Remember, the South has some large plantations, but only 3% of people in the South have large plantations. About 17% of folks in the South have what would be kind of a small farm. Okay, but 80% of Southerners don't own slaves. They don't really own land. If they own land, it's very, very minimal. The commodity output is 70% in the north, and the number of factories in the north is about 85%. So, in terms of the economy, the north has most of the major advantages. So, it's truly um, fascinating that the South would be able to endure for 4 years. Now, I mentioned that one's belief in their rightness in a situation is an important benefit, but it's always important to keep that kind of in our minds. Um, Not everyone in the North was an abolitionist, and we saw that with the past two elections, that while some didn't necessarily believe that slavery was right, they also didn't really want to advocate for total abolition and equality between those who were black and those who were white. African Americans in the North, though, really recognized that a Union victory would ultimately mean freedom or emancipation. They recognized that if the northern states win, then they would most likely be able to be granted emancipation at some point. Initially, though, and this is important, in 1861 and 1862, African Americans, whether enslaved or free, are blocked from serving in the Union Army. Many abolitionists joined African Americans in recognizing that the war and emancipation were sort of connected to one another. Lincoln and other white leaders saw the war as a means solely as a means for preserving the Union. So I want you to understand that preserving the Union is not the same thing as emancipating slaves. By 1864 and 1865, it will become evident that those two things are together, right? But in 1861 and 1862, these are two separate, distinct entities. So, um, this kind of view of Union preservation is really dominant. And it's also kind of combined and encouraged by sincere belief in 1861 that the war will be over quickly, that it will be very short. So even through 1862, we continue to see black soldiers be rejected from serving in the Union Army. Again, this is connected to racist views of African American men, but at the same time, a belief in sort of this is about preserving the Union, not about freeing slaves. Remember, even those border states that stay in the Union, right, still have slaves. Southern slaves took advantage of the war, and so they used this as an opportunity to run away from the plantation, from their masters, and from slavery. Some slaves offered the Union troops their knowledge of the land as well as Confederate troops' location. An interesting man named Abraham Galloway. He actually goes and meets Lincoln later on. He is a slave in South Carolina, and he is very knowledgeable. He's grown up in the area, so he knows the terrain, and he would travel with the Confederacy and serve as a cook. But then he was really, that was sort of his day job. His night job was that he was a spy. And so he would listen to Confederate soldiers talk about battle plans and strategies and troop movement. And he would sneak away at night, and no one would notice that he was missing because no one paid attention, right, to the slaves. And so he would sneak away at night, and he would appear with the Union troops, and he would give them all of this, secret information about battle strategy from the Confederates. And then he would sneak away again and sneak back into a Confederate camp and pick up right where he left off. And he does this throughout most of the Civil War. He later on meets Lincoln, he and another spy. And when he meets Lincoln, they go into the front door at the White House, and the friend that goes with him actually writes in a journal, and he writes that he has never ever in his entire life entered the front door of a home, not a white home. And I think those are very powerful words because they really demonstrate the position and the location in which slaves are kept very separate from their white counterparts. So, again, some of these slaves are kind of spies or couriers. Union General Benjamin Butler claimed a lot of fugitive slaves as contraband of the war. And when he claimed them as contraband, meaning he's taken the spoil, so to speak, of the war, he offers them military protection. And when he does this, more and more slaves will begin to run away and they'll just sort of show up at these Union troop locations with the hope that they will become contraband and be taken in and protected. Congress, and again, even though there were certainly Northerners who would be considered Congress because they've seceded, they're not. So when we talk about Congress, we're just talking about those in the Union. The Congress actually encourages and furthers this policy by passing what is called the Confiscation Act. And it's a piece of legislation that is enacted solely for the purpose of weakening and undermining the Confederacy. Um, Basically, it said that if slaves were found in particular areas after battles, that they would become confiscated. They would be taken into kind of the protection of the Union military. Now, this particular piece of legislation really gives a lot of hope to abolitionists who want the end result of the Civil War. Now, it's officially a war, to be the immediate emancipation of slaves. But the Confederacy gains a lot of support from the slaveholding Indians. Remember, we talked about the Creek, some of the Cherokee, the Seminole, who also own slaves who are black. The Confederacy's Indian allies do play a critical role in a lot of these very, very early battles. The Cherokee and Seminole warriors particularly contributed to that Confederate victory at what was called the Second Battle of Bull Run. So same location, second battle, also a victory for the Confederacy. So again, natives, Indians, and the Confederacy fighting to sort of preserve slavery as it is. Now, remember, the natives have had a pretty difficult relationship with whites in general. The hope is, from the perspective of the natives, that if the Confederacy is victorious, that the natives will be left kind of independently and left alone because they have helped the Confederacy to secure their secession and separation from the Union. Union sentiment regarding the war's purpose begins to turn in the face of a lot of defeats. Initially, remember, the focus of the Union in terms of this war is to preserve the Union, to reunite the Confederacy with the Union, not really to address this issue of slavery. But as time goes on and the South has had a couple of large victories, the Union recognizes that, this has to be about more than just preserving the Union. And so Northerners begin to kind of connect the war, not just with the South seceding, but why they seceded. And the South would say this was, the secession was to preserve and protect their way of life. But their way of life includes the peculiar institution of slavery. And so the Union will begin to recognize that slavery has to be addressed, right, nationally, in order to truly have clear lines in kind of right and wrong in the Civil War. Congress ultimately begins to pass a series of acts that reflect those changes, including one that does allow African Americans to enlist in the military. Back up, got ahead of myself there. As the white Union troops begin to confront the realities of slavery, they become opposed to slavery. Remember, we've talked about this several times throughout the semester. As Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe, as David Walker, as these people are starting to share the real story of slavery, not this sort of distant thing that we don't hear about, this servitude kind of concept. As their words are permeating the North, and more people are learning about what slavery really looks like in the South, especially after the 1830s. More and more people understand that slavery is real and that slavery is harsh. And so the Union troops really begin to actually see the reality of slavery while they're fighting in the South. I've said this several times, I say this often, we can't hold people accountable for what they don't know. Right? But once they know something, then we can hold them accountable. So many in the North didn't really know what slavery was truly about until they started to read and hear that. And so then they had to make some tough choices, right? They had to decide where they stood on this issue of slavery. Now we have Union soldiers who are seeing up close the physical, brutal realities of slavery. And so this causes them to become more opposed to slavery. There's a steady increase in casualties as well. So as the war goes on, more and more people are dying. And the Union recognizes that in order to be able to sustain and to continue their battle, they need more people to fight, right? They need more people to be able to die. And so this causes Northerners to support African American enlistment as well. Now, by 1863, tens of thousands of African American troops, including the Massachusetts 54th Colored Infantry, were contributing to Northern victories. Now, if you have a chance, I would encourage you to watch the movie Glory. It has Denzel Washington in it. It has Morgan Freeman. It has, can't think of who else, a couple of other famous actors. And it's about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And what you see is that very early on, while African Americans were allowed to enlist, they weren't given guns. So they were given very menial labor types of jobs. So their jobs might be to clean guns, might be to prepare meals. In many cases, they weren't given boots, they weren't given adequate rations, and they were absolutely paid less than white soldiers. So don't believe or don't kid yourself into thinking that because the Union allowed African Americans to serve in the military, they were treated equally. However, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which is an all-black regiment with a white commander, Robert Gould Shaw, is incredibly victorious. The men fight with incredible bravery, and this sends a clear message to those in the North who did not believe that African Americans could, one, fight, but two, could be brave enough to do so. And so, again, the 54th Massachusetts, very, very good movie called Glory if you get a chance to watch it. Okay, so again, support for making emancipation the longer goal continues to increase through late 1862. But Lincoln is really afraid that if he focuses in on emancipation, more Southerners will be frustrated. Those border states who do still have slavery may join the Confederate cause. And so Lincoln is very reluctant to really talk about major emancipation. The Confederacy realized that if they were going to be able to sustain a battle against the Union, that they were going to need certainly munitions, weapons, food supplies, those kinds of things. But they also needed to be recognized as a legitimate, separate entity from the Union as these Confederate states. And so what they want to do is secure European recognition. And I think I got ahead of myself. I didn't change the slide. Yeah, let's see. I think I skipped ahead there. Nope, I did not. Okay. So one of the things that they want is this diplomatic recognition. And so they work very hard to achieve diplomatic recognition and to get the rest of Europe to recognize them as a separate entity. Now, the Confederacy is working for this because they need to be able to sustain themselves economically while they are fighting. A lot of abolitionist lecturers also go into Britain, and they explain what's going on in Britain or what's going on in the United States to the folks in Britain in terms of the realities of slavery. Now, this really puts a lot of pressure and support on the Union and on Lincoln to kind of formally address the issue of slavery and to make emancipation the ultimate goal. Now, it's important to understand here that even though the Britain is putting this pressure on the Union, that Britain actually does still recognize slavery in a lot of their colonies that they are holding throughout the world, places like India, Africa itself, but that slavery in terms of indentured servitude is also protected in Great Britain as well. Now, Lincoln drafts kind of what he calls to be his emancipation, his formal statement about slavery. But he wants to release this statement in terms of a victory on the part of the Union. What he doesn't want to do is have a defeat and a defeat and a defeat. He needs some kind of victory to encourage the folks in the North, Europe, to support this cause and to not support the South. Because he felt like the emancipation, this conversation, this statement about freeing the slaves really needed to be connected to Union victory, right? Not a Union defeat, right? So he wanted to connect emancipation with victory, not emancipation with a weakness. So Lincoln announces a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet after a very, very, very bloody battle at Antietam Creek in September of 1862. Now, Lincoln later signs an official final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. However, and maybe more importantly than the Emancipation Proclamation itself, it only applies to states that are in rebellion. So it does not apply to northern states, some of which do still have slaves, particularly New Jersey still has about 5,000 slaves through the Civil War. It doesn't apply to the border states like Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Delaware. And this is important, okay, because Lincoln doesn't want to alienate the border states. He doesn't want to increase the size of the Confederacy. But the Emancipation Proclamation really focuses on military reasons for ending slavery, not moral reasons. So the Emancipation Proclamation is not a moral argument against slavery, and it doesn't, quote, free the slaves, because Lincoln, at least according to the Confederacy, had no authority and no jurisdiction over the slavery. So it's almost like the president today saying, well, I'm going to make a law for another country. Now, when Lincoln issues this Emancipation Proclamation, his hope is that it will tell slaves in the South, slaves in the border states, abolitionists, conscientious objectors, that the ultimate hope at the end of this war is that there will be abolition. Now, even though there are a lot of limitations on this proclamation, immediately abolitionists and African Americans view it in a positive light. They view it as a good thing that will end ultimately in slavery. Now, again, just to remind you, so you have again, a mental note. Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri are slave states, but they remain in the Union through the Civil War. So they do have slaves in those particular areas. Importantly, and just as a kind of a footnote reminder, New Jersey, some of the northern areas do still hold slaves through the Civil War. The transcript of the Emancipation Proclamation, which I want to read just a little bit to you to give you kind of the gist of it. He's issuing it initially again to Congress in September and then making it public in January. He writes, or he says, now therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of power vested in me, as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, due on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, in accordance with the purpose so to do publicly proclaim for the full period of 100 days from the first mentioned order, designate the states and parts of states wherein the people, therefore respectively, are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following to wit. So he's very specific. He says, he calls out any area that is in rebellion. So there are some states that are not in rebellion that do have slaves, and he says, hey, I'm not talking to you guys. I'm just talking to South Carolina. I'm just talking to Mississippi. I'm just talking to the states that are in rebellion. And then he gets very specific and he calls those states by name. He says Arkansas, Texas, and that's, let me show you, that's right here. He says Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except for, and then he lists some very specific areas. Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also, and then he lists some more areas of Virginia. So he's very specific, because what he doesn't want to happen is the areas who have not seceded from the Union, he doesn't want them to feel like they have to make a choice now and leave the Union. So it's important to understand that even though the Emancipation Proclamation does important work, in that it really makes slavery the primary focal point of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation does not, quote, free the slaves, as is often how it is explained. It frees the slaves that are in states or areas of rebellion, but it doesn't emancipate all slaves in the United States. We will continue the rest of this section in the next video. Thanks.